There's a specific kind of comfort in watching history's darkest moments from a distance. You read about what happened. The crowds cheering, the neighbors turning in neighbors, the ordinary people who became instruments of something monstrous. And somewhere, quietly, a thought forms. A thought so automatic you barely notice it. I would not have done that. Maybe something more specific. I would have been the one who resisted, who hid someone, who refused. That thought feels like self-knowledge. It feels like moral clarity. Jung would say it's neither. The certainty itself is the problem. The distance you feel from that darkness isn't evidence of your difference from it. According to Jung, it might be evidence of exactly the opposite. This is where the idea of the shadow gets strange, and where it becomes something most people never encounter because the version that circulates is too small. The familiar version says, you have a dark side you're not aware of. Fine, useful, true. But Jung spent the later decades of his life consumed by something larger and, in many ways, more disturbing. He wasn't just watching individuals repress their shadows. He was watching entire peoples do it. Entire nations. Entire civilizations. He watched it happen in Europe, from inside Europe. That matters, because what he documented wasn't an aberration, a temporary madness that overcame otherwise healthy societies. What he saw was a mechanism, ancient, structural, and still running. If you've ever looked at a group of people, a political tribe, a nation, a community, and thought, how could they not see what they're doing? This might be the question worth sitting with. How would you know if your group was doing the same thing right now? That's not a rhetorical provocation. It's the actual question Jung spent his life trying to answer. And the answer is more uncomfortable than most people are ready for, because it begins not with them, but with the almost invisible process by which any group constructs its identity through exclusion, drawing a boundary and placing something on the other side of it. In 1945, as the war ended and Europe tried to make sense of what had happened, Jung wrote something that shocked many of his contemporaries. He argued that the German people had not been uniquely evil. They had been uniquely possessed. And that distinction mattered enormously. Possession, in Jung's framework, doesn't mean supernatural occupation. It means something psychologically precise. When the contents of the unconscious take over conscious life without being recognized as unconscious. When the shadow stops being something a person or a group carries and starts being something that carries them. What made this observation so difficult to receive was its implication. If Germany had been possessed by its collective shadow, then the question every other nation had to ask was, what is ours? What are we not looking at? The victors preferred a different story. One where the darkness had been localized, defeated, and contained. Jung found that story dangerously naive. Here's how he understood the mechanism. Every group, every culture, every nation, every community that develops a shared identity does so partly through exclusion. To say we are this requires deciding, consciously or not, we are not that. The qualities that threaten the group's self-image get pushed down, denied, projected outward. And then, this is the critical step, they get assigned to someone else. The shadow finds a body. Whatever the group cannot tolerate in itself becomes the defining characteristic of the enemy, the outsider, the other. Once that projection is in place, something strange happens to perception. A projected quality seems to glow, hyper-visible in the other, while remaining completely invisible in the self. A group that projects its own hunger for power onto its enemies becomes incapable of seeing its own hunger for power, even as it accumulates, even as it acts on it, even as it escalates. The blindness and the accumulation move together. Jung saw this not as a failure of intelligence or education. Highly educated people, sophisticated cultures, were just as susceptible, sometimes more so, because they had more elaborate systems for justifying what they were doing. The shadow doesn't yield to argument. It operates beneath the level where argument reaches. Stop. Feel the weight of that for a moment. Because it means the problem isn't ignorance exactly. It's the structure of group identity itself. There's a detail about how this works that tends to get lost when people discuss Jung's ideas at scale, and it's the detail that makes the whole thing visceral rather than abstract. The intensity of the reaction is the signal. When a group encounters the thing it has projected onto an outsider, the emotional response isn't mild discomfort. It's fury, disgust, a sense of profound wrongness that feels righteous, feels justified, feels almost sacred. That heat, that specific outsized heat, is what Jung called the mark of projection. Because ordinary disagreement doesn't produce it. What produces it is contact with your own disowned material wearing a foreign face. A nation that has repressed its own capacity for brutality doesn't simply dislike brutality in its enemies. It becomes obsessed with it, catalogs it, returns to it, builds entire cultural narratives around it. The brutality of the other becomes the central story, while the group's own brutality remains somehow peripheral, always contextualized, always justified, always different in kind. This pattern belongs to no particular political orientation, no particular century, no particular geography. Jung was insistent on that. The mechanism doesn't discriminate. It runs wherever groups form identity, which is to say, everywhere human beings have ever organized themselves into a we. What changes is only the content. What gets projected differs by culture, by era, by what each particular group most needs to deny about itself. The structure stays the same. And here is where it becomes harder to hold at arm's length. You are in groups. Everyone is. The question Jung kept returning to, the one he found almost no one was willing to genuinely ask, was not, do other groups do this? But, what is my group expelling right now? Something uncomfortable is always being assigned to the outside, so it doesn't have to be examined on the inside. The question is only what, and whether anyone inside is willing to look. That question doesn't have a comfortable answer. It might not have any answer you can access from inside the group itself. That's part of what makes it so structurally difficult and so important. Jung believed, and this is the part of his thinking that remains most unsettling, that the collective shadow doesn't just passively exist. It accumulates. And at some point, accumulated shadow seeks discharge. He called this Enantiodromia, a term he borrowed from Heraclitus, the tendency of things pushed to an extreme to suddenly reverse into their opposite. The river dammed long enough doesn't just stay contained. The pressure builds until the structure fails, and then everything that was held back moves at once, with a force proportional to how long it was denied. He watched this happen in Europe. He had watched, years earlier, his own unconscious produce something he couldn't explain. Visions of floods, of a sea of blood covering the land, which he recorded with confusion before understanding arrived in 1914. He spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. How a civilization's unexamined contents could surface not in individual breakdown, but in collective catastrophe. This isn't a historical curiosity. The same mechanism that produced those catastrophes is present, structurally identical, smaller in scale but not different in kind, in the political polarization that makes entire populations feel the other side isn't just wrong, but incomprehensible, in the way communities coalesce around contempt as much as belief, in the speed with which a group that defines itself by its compassion can produce extraordinary cruelty toward whoever falls outside the boundary of who deserves that compassion. The scale is different. The structure is the same. Here is where Jung makes a turn that most people miss, because it's easier to stay with the diagnosis than to follow him into what he thought could actually be done. He didn't believe the collective shadow could be addressed collectively, at least not directly. Mass movements aimed at awakening society to its projections tend to replicate the structure they're trying to dismantle. They find a new enemy, a new repository for the disowned material, a new face to put the shadow on. The mechanism continues under a different ideology. What could interrupt it? The only thing Jung found that could interrupt it was individuals doing the harder, slower, less dramatic work of meeting their own shadow. Their own, not the group's. Because the collective shadow is not some separate entity floating above individuals. It's assembled from individual contributions. Every person who has never examined their own projections, their own disowned material, their own disproportionate reactions, adds to it. Every person who does that work, who withdraws even a portion of their projections, reduces it by that much. This is not a satisfying answer. It doesn't scale neatly. There's no movement to join, no campaign to support, no external action that substitutes for it. Jung was explicit about this, and it made him unpopular in certain circles. The entry point is always interior. The collective becomes different only as individuals become different, not through persuasion or politics alone, but through the specific, uncomfortable encounter with what they have refused to see in themselves. If you've ever caught yourself mid-reaction and wondered where that came from, that moment of catching something before it fully fires, a small gap between stimulus and response where something unfamiliar looks back at you, that's the territory Jung was pointing at. Not a destination, a practice without an endpoint. The shadow doesn't get resolved, it gets recognized. And recognized, it has less power to act through you without your knowledge. That's where Jung leaves you, not with a system, with a direction to look. The next time you encounter a group, any group, including yours, performing absolute certainty about who the enemy is, who the darkness lives in, who the problem originates from, there's a question available that most people inside that group will never think to ask. What would have to be true about this group for this projection to make sense? What would it need to have buried? Jung didn't believe this question would be welcome. He didn't believe it would be popular, or that it would spread easily, or that most people would have any appetite for it. He thought it was the most important question a person could ask, and he thought almost no one would. That smallness, the recognition that the mechanism is larger than any individual response to it, that it has been running for as long as humans have formed tribes, that it will likely continue running long after this particular moment passes, could feel like despair. Jung didn't experience it that way. He experienced it as something closer to awe. The shadow is not a flaw in the system. It is the system, working exactly as human psychology works, doing exactly what it has always done. One of them, you're swimming.